Abigail Baird is a professor of psychology at Vassar College and the principal investigator of the Laboratory for Adolescent Science. She earned her undergraduate degree from Vassar College and both an MA and a PhD from Harvard University. Following positions at both Harvard and Dartmouth, Abigail returned to Vassar in 2006, where she continues her teaching and research today. The primary focus of Dr. Baird's research is developmental neuroscience, with a particular focus on the changes in reasoning and decision-making that take place during adolescence. Abigail is the author of 2 books and has published numerous scientific and popular press articles about her research. Her research has received awards from Harvard University and the Society for Research on Psychopathology. She has been elected to several scientific societies, including the International Society for Behavioral Neuroscience and the Dana Alliance for Brain Initiatives. Her professional accomplishments also include serving as secretary of the Association for Psychological Science, invited faculty of the New York State Judicial Institute, and advisory board member on the Campaign for Youth Justice. Dr. Baird has been a consistent participant in the American Association for the Advancement of Science's award-winning neuroscience educational program for the members of the judicial system, and her work on adolescent brain development contributed to the amicus briefs that helped the United States Supreme Court abolish the death penalty for juveniles and more recently abolish life sentences without the possibility for parole for juveniles. Following this work, Dr. Baird was elected to the National Committee on Lawyers and Scientists, a joint committee between the American Association for Advancement of Science and the American Bar Association that serves to advise national policy at the intersection of science and law. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Baird.
Thanks. Okay. Please don't hold any of that against me. I could have shortened that whole thing, just been a nerd. So this is my talk, which is fantastic. So the title of my talk, the subtitle of my talk actually was Why I'm Not Beyonce. So that's a good place to start. So why I'm not Beyonce? Well, for some of you, this might be very obvious why I'm not Beyonce. I don't look a lot like Beyonce. But one of the reasons that I like to start with that question and think about it, why I'm not, is because I see adolescence as an age of opportunity, of optimism, of like, when you think about who you thought you were going to be when you were a teenager, what you dreamed up in terms of what was possible for you, it was completely unrealistic in the most wonderful way. And so when I think about, as a teenager, like, what did I really think I was going to do with my life, I probably would have been Beyonce, but that job got taken. And I also lack some of the basic things, like I'm not a good singer, not a terribly good dancer. My dad's not good at management. I have a pretty good work ethic, but I don't have that kind of work ethic. And there are a lot of reasons. But the main point of that, what sounds like kind of a silly example, is that you dream big. You dream really big. And one of the things that we forget when adolescents are getting into trouble or are struggling is that they also, in the way that they have the capacity to get into a ton of trouble, they also have the capacity to get themselves out of a ton of trouble. They have the capacity to see things and imagine things and believe in things that we as adults find it very, very hard to believe in. So the next slide that you can't see is actually my favorite quote from a story. My mom used to read us a lot when we were children, from Alice in Wonderland. Some of you may be familiar with that book. And it's a quote, the caterpillar asks Alice who she is. And she says, I hardly know, sir, just at present. I knew who I was when I woke up this morning, but I must have changed several times since then. Now, I remember hearing this and thinking that it was about growing up. And my mom, who is a teacher and also a hippie, said, well, you know, honey, but don't do drugs. And I was like, okay, but it's really, I mean, changing that much, it's about growing up. And she's like, right, but also don't eat mushrooms. And I was like, okay, but Alice is just like going from being like a kid to like being in middle school. My mom's like, right, but if someone offers you something to smoke, just don't. And I was like, and then I started thinking about it. I was like, well, I mean, honestly, think about the story of Alice in Wonderland. In one moment, she's so tiny that she can't open a door. And 5 minutes later, she's so big that her arms and legs are busting out of the windows of a house. Oh, and by the way, there's this evil queen who wants to kill her because she heard from someone else that Alice looked at a boy that the queen likes, and so she wants to cut her head off. If that's not 8th grade, I don't know what else it could possibly be. Think about 8th grade. All of a sudden, your body flips out on you, and people want to kill you for no reason. It's 8th grade. It's Alice in Wonderland. Just think about that for a second. So it surrounds us. We all know this. And one of the things that's very true, and I don't necessarily want you to spend a lot of time thinking about it because I'm not here to traumatize you, but we've all been through it. We've all been through it. And it's not pathology. And that's one of the main things I'm going to try to reiterate over and over again, is that adolescence is not inherently pathological, although it's often described as such. It can be difficult. For some people, it's not so difficult. But for a lot of people, it can be difficult. But difficulty doesn't necessarily mean pathology. So then my next slide, see how this is going perfectly so far. My next slide goes over the 2 main points that I wanted to hopefully drive home. And again, it underscores just how smart, in fact, I am and why I'm an expert at these things, because these are very, very profound ideas that you've probably never thought about before. The first point is that adolescents cannot feel the future. Now, that sentence makes no sense to most of you. It shouldn't really make much sense because it doesn't. We talk a lot about how adolescents aren't good at predicting the future, and they aren't good at anticipating outcomes. But I don't actually think the problem is about knowledge. And we heard about this a little bit in Dr. Latessa's talk. And I couldn't agree with him more when he reminded us that standing and lecturing teenagers and giving them information about things doesn't do anything. And I don't think it's because they can't think. I think that they know a lot of the stuff that we're trying to. We think if we just educate them a little more, they'll make better decisions. I don't think that's the problem. I think it's that they actually don't feel the potential outcome. And that shouldn't make a lot of sense right now. But once my amazing presentation comes up and we get to go through all the bits of this question, I hope to teach you something new that actually, if I do it right, shouldn't be totally new. Hopefully you hear my take on this and go, oh yeah, that fits with what I see. So I don't think a lot of the decision-making problems that they get into have to do with knowing. I think they have to actually do with feeling. But those things, you can't totally tease them apart, as hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about. The second major point, and this is the really profound one that we're going to cover, is that friends really matter a lot. And the emphasis, I added that myself. That was my own idea. So I know this is, again, if you work with teenagers, this has probably never occurred to you ever before that their friends are important. But they are. They're very important. Again, see, that's why I'm an expert in these things. Friends are very, very important. And I'm going to also tell you a little bit about why and what friends actually do to the teenage brain. They do really interesting things to the teenage brain that, again, hopefully won't surprise you. Hopefully what we talk about, I'm just giving you kind of another angle to look at the same stuff that you all are dealing with and seeing on a regular basis. Okay, so we still have no presentation. My next slide would show you a picture of a couple, older adolescent, young adult, college-age looking, boy and girl, looking at each other. And they have a certain amount of a sort of an amorous expression on their face. And I want you to take a minute and think about what it feels like in your body when you have a crush on somebody. What does it feel like when how do you know that you have a crush on someone or that you think someone's cute? What does your body do? And don't, keep above the waist, what does your body do? Keep it clean. Butterflies in your stomach, right? How about, does anything happen to your breathing? You might get a little short of breath. Does your heart rate change at all if you think someone's cute? And in the picture, you can actually see that the boy's blushing a little bit. Okay, now I want you to imagine what your body would feel like, same parts. What would those parts feel like if you jumped in your pool and came face to face with a great white shark? What would happen to your breathing? It would speed up. Your heart rate would speed up. Your stomach, we wouldn't call it butterflies, but it would flip-flop, right? Your stomach would flip over, flop over, whatever you want to call it. And actually, your skin would also redden. We could call it flushing instead of blushing. But the exact same thing would happen. So really, this is a cautionary note about dating. Just don't. No, that's not actually what my talk is about. My point is that those two responses are exactly the same. Your bodily response. Now, how your brain interprets that information should be really different, right? Because in an ideal world, you should have a very, very different response to I have a crush versus I'm about to be crushed, right? One you should probably move towards, slowly and with caution, the having a crush. And the other one, a great white shark, its mouth is open, you need to leave, right? Wait, do you guys not know that? Yes, you need to go. That's as fast as you can. So here's the rub. How do you know when your heart's racing because someone's cute or you're about to die? And if you talk to a lot of teenagers, or if you remember back to your first couple crushes, a lot of them will tell you, well, I knew I liked him because I thought I was going to die. Like I really just, a lot of things, why do we even call them crushes? That's a physically painful thing to think about. So why are they physically painful? Because they physically engender a whole lot of stuff. I see someone coming with, I presume, bad news. Oh, the people are there, yes. The what? Videos are not going to work. Okay, I can probably act most of them out. There's one with 4 girls. It'll be interesting to see what I do. I'm curious to see what I do. Okay. And does this have a pointer or no? No? That's okay. I don't need a pointer. I have so much more than I had 3 minutes ago. This is great. So then I was going to show you this. So clicker also doesn't work any. Can I just? Okay. So you can go to next. If anyone can hear me, you can go to next slide if you feel like it, or. It didn't work. Well, it's a cute picture at any rate. So there are these 2 systems in the brain called, it's good that I teach because these things do happen when you are a teacher all the time. Oh, there he is, okay. That worked actually, so let's try that again. There we go. All right, this is a good system. I don't want a clicker, I want to keep doing what I'm doing. So you got these 2 systems, emotion and cognition. Cognition is the thinking part of your brain. Everyone always talks about feelings and thoughts like they're separate things. And when you're a little kid, they kind of are. They're very separate systems in the brain. I have 7-year-old twins, and they're really just starting to use these guys together at all. But usually with small people, you make a decision either based on how you feel about things or how you think about things. And if you're ever around little children, you know this is true. What's really funny is that grown-ups think we still do this. We think that we make, when we have to make a decision about, say, buying a house or renting an apartment, we make a very rational decision, make a cognitive, a thoughtful decision based on all the information. And we make the most reasonable choice. And we can defend that choice. And I promise you that you're wrong, that it's not a thoughtful choice. There's thought in it, but it's got a lot of emotion as well. You have a gut response. When you walk into a house that you're going to rent or buy, you don't know why you like it. You just do. And do not dismiss that, because I'm going to explain to you how that's based on years and years and years of accumulated experience. And that flash judgment that you just used is better than any thought you can actually generate on your own. It's an amalgamation. It's a huge library of your life experience that you can call up in a second, and you don't even have to try. You don't even have to try. I'll give you an example. So in a couple weeks, I'm going to get to go to my house in Maine. How many of you just thought of the coast of Maine? Did anyone get a picture in your head of Maine? Did anyone get a picture of Maine and you've never been to Maine? If you had a picture in your head and pop into your head when I said I'm going to go to my summer house in Maine, and you had some picture of an ocean pop into your head, and you've never been there, why were you doing that? I didn't ask you to do that. But your brain just did it. Did anyone get a house with white clapboard, white boards on it? Did anyone imagine that? I didn't ask you to. And actually ours is shingled. It's not white clapboards. But the idea that those things, why did your head just give you that information? You didn't ask for it. I didn't ask for it. It just gave it to you. So it's a small example of how your gut, this is your automatic response to things. And it's helpful, right? Because if I wasn't on a stage, if I was sitting next to you at a cocktail party and I said the same thing, you would know, you'd be able to ask a couple questions because your brain gives you some information about Maine to talk about. Is that a far, isn't that, wait, you're from Poughkeepsie, so that's a big drive. How long, blah, 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 blah. These 2 systems, we love to think they're separable. We love to think that we can actually, sorry, I'm just gonna take my glasses off. No, that's worse. The lights are a big glare, but I actually like seeing you. We like to think these are separate systems when we're grown-ups. They're not. They work together really smoothly. And the goal of adolescence is to get these 2 systems, your feeling systems and your thinking systems, to work fluidly. And if they do, you make good decisions as a grown-up. This process of learning how to do this has a lot of missteps, has a lot of false starts, and that's where we get a lot of our hiccups that can come with adolescent development. All right, I'll try that again. Oh my God, I love this. I'm getting this for my classroom for the fall. I'll just have to find some undergrad to sit in the back of the room and do it for me. Okay, so these are the 2 points that I told you about before, so I'm sorry if I actually was a little bit out of order. And we'll go to our next one. Okay, so now I've got to teach you a tiny bit about the human brain, but I promise it won't hurt, and I promise it won't be overly nerdy. It might be a little bit nerdy, but it's kind of fun too, because there's some really, really cool parts of the brain. So we'll do, okay, the amygdala. This is my second favorite part of the brain, and I know you're dying to know what my favorite parts of the brain are, so that's why I'm bringing them to you. This is my second favorite part. I'm saving my very first favorite part of the brain for a little bit later. Now, the amygdala, the easiest way to remember it is that it's the burglar alarm. It is the burglar alarm of the brain. Its job is to keep you alive at all costs. It's located down deep in the brain. There's one in each hemisphere. It's a very primitive structure. It's about the size and shape of an almond, which is the Greek word for amygdala. Burglar alarm. Dogs have them, cats have them, lizards have them. This is a very old, simple structure. You're born with one that's pretty much ready to go. And in science, the way we remember what it does is we talk about it as being responsible for the 4 Fs, all of which are responsible for keeping you alive. So whenever anything happens to you and you see anything, hear anything, the only sense that goes around the amygdala is smell, and we can talk about that afterwards if anyone's interested, but I'm not sure it's relevant to a lot of the work you do. Everything you see, everything you interact with, the amygdala checks it to figure out if you have to deal with it. And when I say deal with it, what I mean is a very old response that some of you are probably familiar with, the fight or flight response. You guys have heard of this? Okay. Did you know there are actually 4 Fs? It's not just fight or flight. So the first one is feeding. So food, obviously, if you need food to stay alive. So I run into you in a dark alley and I'm starving and you give me a great cake, then my amygdala sort of tags that memory as, ooh, friend, good person. Food in the alley, good person. Survival, that's great. If you sneer at me and run away with your cake, the amygdala also does help me remember that. Like, okay, that person's not nice, they're not gonna help me get my food, I might die. Next, we have fighting. So if you're gonna fight, the amygdala prepares you to do so. It actually slows down your digestion. It shunts blood into your bigger muscles. So also if you're gonna flee, which is next, it sort of gets your adrenal system up, so you start secreting adrenaline. Your heart rate goes up, your breathing rate goes up, blood goes into your big muscles, digestion slows down or stops. A lot of the reproductive system shuts down or stops because let's just, it's just us in a theater. If you're running for your life from a tiger, that's probably not the best time to ovulate. Just saying, it's probably not. The other thing it does to save energy and time is it actually has a projection. It can shut off the thinking parts of the brain, the higher functions of the brain. There's actually a way that it really even economizes energy within the brain. So if you're running for your life, you also can't do long division, which again seems like it's maybe a silly example. But if any of you have ever taken a class where you've been terrified of failing or sitting in there and trying to learn the material, if you're truly in fight or flight, which some students do get themselves into. I know I did in organic chemistry on a regular basis. I couldn't learn a thing. And this response, which will keep you alive and is critical to keeping you alive, can actually really interfere with your learning. And that shoots off into the whole area of how trauma has lasting impacts in terms of kids and teenagers being able to help themselves in their recovery. The last F, which is probably the most important when we think about the long-term survival of our species, is, of course, reproduction. It's the 4th F. Hey, at least there are like 5 people here paying attention, which is good. All right, so we'll hang out. All right, go ahead. Now, obviously, something like the amygdala that's a little bit primitive, you don't want that guy, and believe me, it's a guy, running the whole show. You don't want that structure responsible for all of your behavior. So it needs someone to kind of rein it in and help balance its formidable power because it does keep you alive. So it works very closely, reciprocally talking a lot with something called the frontal cortex. And this is why neuroscience is hard, because the frontal cortex, believe it or not, is in the front of the head. It's in the front of the head. That's why it's called the frontal cortex. See, it's tricky like that. So what do you need to know about the frontal cortex? Well, it's the last part of the brain to develop. It's the first to wither. It's the most sensitive to toxins. And it is the part of the brain that is the most tailored to you, to who you are. It waits to develop so that it can be customized based on your own needs. It actually develops in response to your culture. And that's one of the very, very cool things about adolescence. We have to go through adolescence because we need to train up this frontal cortex. The frontal cortex is a coordinator of a lot of behavior. And it waits to develop because adolescence is the time when we get our adult social skills. If you think about it, the social demands on an adult and a toddler are incredibly different, right? So I was at the grocery store last week, got through checkout, and heard the total, and tried whining to get out of paying for my groceries. And I was just like, oh my God, that's so much money, I don't want to pay that. And the cashier will just stare at you. And you can whine at them for hours. Well, no, they probably wouldn't let you do it for hours. You'd probably get arrested. But you can try even, stomping your feet. And, people act like an adult. Well, unless you've had the right training, the frontal cortex doesn't know what to tell you how to do. It's very much like language. Most of you don't remember learning your first language. But you did, and you just kind of soaked it up. And so during adolescence, this guy gets trained up along with another piece of brain that we'll talk about shortly, to learn how to pick out the right behavior and how to regulate your behavior in the best way possible. And it does this in many different situations. And the best way, I think, to teach you about it is to think about it a little bit like the conductor of an orchestra. And if you think about that example, in this example, music is behavior. So when you have beautiful music, it's the same thing as having beautiful behavior. So the frontal cortex kind of gets all these different parts of the brain working, says, okay, you speed up, you slow down, you come up louder, and let's all do this right. Now, if the brain was going to sort of, if you think about it like an orchestra, and if they had been practicing the Brandenburg concertos for weeks and had it down pat, and the conductor says, okay, it's time to go, instruments up, and the horn section's like, yeah, that's cool, but we're going to play some Earth, Wind, and Fire. How would that sound? It would sound dissonant. It would sound off. And that's bad behavior. Bad behavior is when you've got a really, really, really good plan, and you go to execute it, and then some part of the brain is like, yeah, no, we're not into that. And either the frontal lobe can't pull them into control because you're not mature enough, or maybe you are plenty mature, and maybe you've had a glass of wine. And if you think about people who've had a glass or 6 of wine, the frontal lobe, that actually fatigues the frontal lobe. And once the frontal lobe's fatigued, you can't organize your behaviors well. Your music doesn't sound as good as it does when you're at full capacity. How many of you, and you don't have to admit this to me, just think about it to yourselves, are more likely to get frustrated or cry or make poor decisions when you're really tired? Is that the best time to ask you something difficult if you're absolutely exhausted? No, because your conductor is half asleep. So this is a very, very important part of the brain when it comes to regulating behavior and understanding how behavior develops. Okay, next. Some of you may have heard of Phineas Gage. Anyone heard of Phineas Gage? He was a railroad worker in Vermont. He was a great guy, family man. He was actually the foreman of his crew. And he was using, to this day, I don't know why they thought this was a good idea, but I wasn't there. Even though my students are like, are you sure? And I'm like, no, it was the 1800s, I'm sure. I'm old, but they were using a metal rod to put some dynamite into a hole in the rock to blow the rock away. And I'm like, sparks? I don't know. But it sparked, and the rod blew under his cheek, out the top of his head, and it landed about 30 yards away. And this happened in Vermont. And Gage, he didn't fall down, he didn't lose consciousness. And I don't know if you guys have ever met anybody from Vermont, but I'm pretty sure I know what he said. He probably said something like, geez. But I don't know, I wasn't there. So he may have had a bigger reaction, but I doubt it. So they took him to Dartmouth, to Hitchcock, and they patched up his head and patched his face, and they sent him home. And he was fine. Except for he developed what those of us who study people clinically would call, he became a jerk. He went from being this great guy to becoming easily provoked into arguments, impulsive. He started drinking and carousing. He got into fights easily. He was argumentative and irritable and unpredictable. And I don't know if that reminds you of any particular group of people, but you might see some comparisons, similarities between the adolescents we love, so irritable, easy to be impulsive, hard time regulating their behavior, seemingly argumentative out of nowhere, but there's an important difference, if I can do my little magic. If you have a brain damaged adult, it's very difficult, especially with frontal lobe damage, it's very difficult to recover from that. And that is kind of game over. It's critically important that you all understand this comparison works because teenagers are still in progress. And Phineas Gage is a great example that told us where to look in terms of what might be changing during the adolescent years, what might be growing. And when we say growing, obviously the forehead there, you don't get a big, your brain doesn't get bigger because your skull is a fixed sphere. So when we say growing, what do we mean by growing? Well, it's becoming more coordinated, just like the body's becoming more coordinated. When you see an awkward teenager in the way they move, their brain is also speaking to itself awkwardly. Its parts are moving a little bit awkwardly. It's learning a whole new set of skills. What worked for you as a toddler, and even as an elementary school kid, no longer works in middle school. So you have to learn a bunch of things. So you heard it here, you can write it down. Teenagers are not brain damaged. They are in progress, and that progress is actually optimistic because that means we still have time to get in there and help them out should that need to happen. All right, next. So I've just given you a whole bunch of brain things. So whoever's clicking for me, this is going to be a tricky one. We're going to have to move. There are a lot of clicks involved here, but it's worth it, I think. So I want to put it all together so you can see how this whole thing works. This is a brain, and you can tell because there are eyes in the front. That's how I usually tell. If I see eyes in the front, I'm like, oh, it's a brain. Okay. You can see the frontal cortex and the amygdala. The back of the brain, over here is the visual cortex, and that's where visual information is processed. And there's a little relay called the thalamus, which none of you have to know about, but I always have to include it in case there's a neuroscientist or an MD in the house who wants to correct me on the exact specifics of how this works. So let's say you're getting ready to come to this amazing program this morning. You go down to get your coffee, and in the kitchen you are confronted with the rock group KISS. Now, I know you people, this is not going to be a problem. So what happens is, click, the thalamus, remember we talked about the amygdala being your burglar alarm, right? So it checks everything you see, everything you hear. So it gets a rough copy of what you're seeing, and it sounds the alarm. We have a problem, KISS is blocking us from our coffee. Now again, I know you people, that's not enough to stop you from flight is not an option. So most of you start to get into your fighting stance because like, Gene Simmons is not keeping me from my coffee. In the meantime, the visual cortex is actually getting the real information from your eyes as to what you're seeing, and it does its whole processing in a more deep way. The amygdala, remember, it's just a burglar alarm. So then the visual cortex sends its information up to the frontal cortex, to the conductor, and says, hold on, wait a second. Amygdala, wait, I'm getting information from visual. You haven't had any coffee, you're still half asleep. That's a poster. Take it down a notch. And it can actually tell the amygdala to be quiet. Now, I like to use this as an example because this has happened to most of you, right? You've had to fight off, not really. It probably hasn't happened to anybody, has it? No. Could have picked a different example, I guess. Or you could think about how many of you have almost had a car wreck without having one? Almost all of you have. And if you have, you can remember your legs shaking, and your heart beating, and if you were trying to talk to someone afterwards, your voice was a little bit trembly. And you talked yourself down. You actually told yourself, okay, it's fine. It didn't happen. I'm okay. The car's okay. If you had your kids with you, it will give you a huge fight or flight response. Kids are okay. Everything's okay. I got to take some deep breaths, and you talk yourself down. That's what the frontal lobe does. It helps put things in context, and it helps regulate this system that's designed to keep you alive. So how does this whole thing work if you're not mature? How does it work if you have that huge response to defend yourself and you have a frontal lobe that's not fully coordinated yet? That's the plight of adolescence, is you're trying to figure out, you're learning as you go, and you don't always do exactly what you want to do. Okay, next. This is one of my favorite studies that was done by a colleague of mine down in the city, Liz Phelps. And what she did was she had people come in, and she had to tape an electrode onto their skin and select the level of shock that was uncomfortable but not painful. Because yes, psychologists still love to shock people. So uncomfortable but not painful shock. And she said to them, okay, I'm going to put you into the MRI, a machine where I can watch your brain activity, And I'm going to show you hundreds of different shapes, all different colors. If you see a blue square, I'm going to shock you. Any other shape, perfectly fine. Blue square, I'm going to shock you. Now, do any of you have an inherent fear of blue squares? Most people don't fear. Blue squares don't really mean much. So she showed them hundreds of shapes, all different colors, green squares, blue circles, all these different things. And then when they came out, what she did was, oh, I'm sorry, this is the critical manipulation. She did not shock anyone. No shocks. 0 shocks were delivered, okay? And it's important to remember that. So when everyone comes out, what she did was she averaged every moment in time when someone saw a blue square compared to all the other shapes that you were told were safe. You were told the blue square is going to be a problem. And when you do that, you get a brain that responds in 2 very specific areas. One is the amygdala, and this is the insula. Let's talk about the amygdala first, and then we'll talk about that. The fight or flight response. So you have a fight or flight response to a blue square. If I told you right now sitting here that you could have a fight or flight response to a blue square, you'd probably be like, I'm not afraid of blue squares. All I have to do is cognitively pair that with some information. Now think about how amazing that is. Think about it. So the frontal lobe is telling the amygdala to fire if it sees a blue square. Totally abstract. Not practical information at all. That's the power of being an adult. And I remember reading this and thinking, I don't think teenagers could do that. I really don't. And here's why. Because if I said to you, there's a dragon behind those doors, it's really important that you don't go in there. Now, there are 2 or 3 guys in the audience that would immediately walk right in there. I grant you that. But most of you as adults, if I really did have a fearful look on my face and told you with emotional sincerity that there was something very dangerous behind that door, most of you would contagiously acquire my fear and avoid that door. A lot of younger people would still have to go look because they just want to check. They just want to make sure. Why? So I saw this was fascinating to me. Now, the other piece of brain that's very active there is the insula. And let's go to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about the insula. Remember I told you the amygdala is my second favorite? This is my very, very, very favorite part of the brain because how many places in the brain can you find food poisoning, cockroaches, and your own mom? That's a pretty cool brain structure, you have to admit. Most of you are like, I don't have to admit anything about the brain. Stop talking about it. Now, why? So if you click one more time, you can see it. We'll get it highlighted here. The insula don't do this, but if you could put your fingers through your ears into your brain, don't do it. I work with teenagers, so I try to repeat things a lot. If you could squish it all the way in, you'd run into the insula. And the insula is the only part of the covering of the brain that's completely folded in and protected. And that means that tells us it's important. So when the brain, over time, evolutionarily has protected itself, it means it's an important structure. Is there anyone in the audience who is still avoiding a food that poisoned them 10 or more years ago? So someone's hand went up right away. Okay. And if you are, even 5 years ago, do you remember what you were wearing on that day? Do you remember where you were? And can you remember anything else from that week specifically? Probably not with that much detail. The vividness, and if you were to talk, if I were to sit you down and talk to you about that experience, and if I were to ask you if you want to eat, that potato salad again that made you so sick, your mouth would start to sweat and you'd start to feel queasy all over again. And any of you who have had food, is anyone that I can actually see, or any of you guys ever had food poisoning down here in the front? Okay. And would you still avoid the food that got you sick? Okay, and if we talk about it long enough, and if you think about it, will you start to get a little nauseous again? Okay, so we'll stop. So think about cupcakes, yummy cupcakes. Now, and a couple people started giggling about this, and we giggle about it because it's almost uncanny that I know I'm not going to eat that thing again, but just thinking about it makes me feel sick. Why? Because of the insula. This is how cool the insula is. So the insula actually measures what's going on in your gut, literally, your gut. So if you start to feel sick or nauseous, the insula records that information. But because it's so well connected in the brain, it records everything else that's happening too. So not only does it have imagine literally like a little video and tape recorder of everything that's going on, but what it can also do is because it's so closely connected with cognitive systems in the brain, cognitively, if I say the magic food that made you sick, memory goes, oh wait, we have information on that. Insula, replay the tape. And the insula can actually project down into your gut and recreate the state that you experienced before. That's really cool if you think about it as a system. Why? Because if you didn't die from food poisoning, and I'm so happy you didn't, we have choices. We're omnivores. You don't have to eat that food again. So what a good system to remember, like, oh, wait, those red berries are the ones that made me barf for 3 days. I shouldn't eat them. Now, some of us aren't so bright. I'm the kind of kid who might walk over a second or third time. But if I feel really nauseous, I might not. So again, it's not a thoughtful decision. It's I would love to have some, but I can't. I just feel sick. Very, very cool thing, right? So, and again, kids aren't quite as good at this as adults because the insula learns over time. And how do we know this? Cockroaches. So if I were to hand you your favorite dessert, you're at my house and we've had a lovely dinner party and I'm putting your favorite dessert right in front of you, and you see a cockroach crawl off the plate. And being the great hostess that I am, I immediately step on it and kill it because I'm a good hostess. How many of you, and again, men can't answer this question, and I have a whole different talk on why men and women vary on these things that I can come back someday and tell you about. Even if you know the cockroach is gone, how many of you would still have trouble eating the dessert if you saw it scurry across the plate where your dessert's located? Most of you, right. Now, if the same scenario had happened in the kitchen and you never saw it, you would go ahead and eat the dessert, right? Now, you're all very smart adults. Would anything happen to you? Would the dessert make you sick? If you did not know that a cockroach had crawled across the plate, would it make you sick? No, and you're desperate, you want to desperately say yes right now because you're so nauseous even thinking about the idea that that's possible. Now, some of you watch the show Survivor or have been to other cultures and know that cockroaches actually have a lot of antibiotic properties. And as my grandmother would say, well, most insects have some protein too. So a little protein, little antibiotics, you can actually eat them. A lot of the different kinds you can eat. You're going, nope. No, so that doesn't help you want to have that piece of that dessert more than I. So I've just given you some very important knowledge, and you're all very bright people. So the cockroaches actually, they will not poison you. You could even, if it was even in the dessert and you ate it accidentally. Oh wait, there's usually someone who goes, ugh. But let's say you ingested it. Oh, right. And where do you feel it when I'm talking about it? You feel it in your gut, right? Why? Well, in America, cockroaches usually tell us that the kitchen's dirty. But there are lots of places where that's not true. The cockroaches don't mean that. So why am I telling you this? Because the insula learns over time. How did you acquire this like icky feeling in response to cockroaches? It was probably from that after-school special about cockroaches, the dangers of cockroaches. No, there probably was not an after-school special about the dangers of cockroaches. Maybe the very serious talk you had with your parents about cockroaches. You probably didn't have that, the talk about cockroaches. No. Flashcards with pictures. No. There was no explicit learning. Over your life, you've accumulated all kinds of anecdotes about people who have gotten sick after eating somewhere, or people have just hinted at, or you've heard stories about, but you've accumulated this feeling, which is fascinating when you think about it, because again, you never had this big explicit learning experience, but it's very deeply ingrained in most Americans that certain things make us nauseous. Now, I guarantee that your mom would bring, I'd bring her into this. Now, I'm sure none of you have ever done anything wrong. I know I haven't. But if you have, and I love asking my college students this, so if you've done something wrong and you have to face the music with your parents, would you rather have them spank you once on the tush or have to go down to the living room and have a conversation about why they're disappointed? How many people want the spank versus the conversation? Just once on the tush. And honestly, if you'd rather have the conversation, you might be a little bit of a sociopath, but that's a different conversation for us to have anyway. How many of you dread that where you're like, no, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed? And you're like, oh, right? So when we feel guilty, where do we feel it? In the gut. We feel it in our gut. Because evolution has done the most amazing thing. It's taken the food poisoning system and it's overlaid social norms on top of it. So that if we do something truly bad, truly wrong, that we understand to be wrong, we feel sick. And just like eating that food that poisoned us before, it makes it highly unlikely that we'll repeat it. Now, what's key, and Dr. Latessa did a great job of explaining this, that system only works, my scenario of having a conversation with someone only works if you feel connected to them. If you don't feel attached, they can't grab your insula. And the name of the game when it comes to development is actually getting a hold of that insula to guide behavior. And I'll give you some examples of how it works or doesn't work, as the case may be. But that same system, that's why this is the best part of the brain. So keeps you alive, but also helps you stick to social norms. And if you think about it, the times in your life when you've almost made those bad decisions, what has stopped you? And a lot of times it's a pang in your gut. They're like, I don't know, something doesn't feel right about that. That's not thoughtful. You're not going through all the information you have. Your body's just telling, it doesn't feel right. Something about that doesn't feel right. All right, next. These are my brothers. And yes, one is sledding over the head of the other. We're from Boston. And I found this picture a while ago. And they both live in Los Angeles now. And I brought it out to them. And we were all in our 30s. And what's amazing, and some of you, if you're not from this immediate area, or even if you are and no longer speak with an accent, as soon as you bring up your childhood, you immediately lapse into whatever accent you grew up with. So I showed them this picture, and you can't tell because of the lighting here, but both of them are cracking up. Okay, so my little brother's literally sledding over the head of my older brother, and they're both laughing hysterically. And so I showed them this picture, and I was like, do you guys remember this? And my little brother says, oh my God, yeah, I totally remember that. You remember that winter? We had so much friggin' snow. My other brother's like, oh, seriously, that was wicked fun. And I was like, why did you guys do that? I don't know, but it was fun. Yeah, it was a piss. That was wicked fun. Seriously, you guys, but what? And he's like, remember then we switched, and I was sledding over your head. And I was like, you switched? Yeah, it was fun. Yeah, it was wicked fun. They're in their 30s, and they still think this is funny. And they're now returning to their youthful accents. And my baby brother was like, oh, and remember after this, we were jumping off the roof into the snowplow, into the piles of snow. And I was like, you guys were jumping off, just the garage roof. And I was like, oh, just the garage roof, jumping off into piles. Why? I don't know, but it was fun. Yeah, it was wicked fun. So it started in my mind thinking about, actually, believe it or not, the blue square, and these abstract things. And when I described to you, like, hey, would it be okay if I were to sled over your head? Most of you would be like, no, I'm good, thank you. There are many of you, and again, there are probably a couple guys who would be like, all right, as long as I get to do it too. But most of you would decline that offer. And so it got me thinking about why adolescents make some of the decisions they do. Now, the NIH and NIMH will not fund questions like, why do adolescents do stupid things? So you actually have to write them in a more scientific, nerdy-sounding thing about individual differences and unique qualities of neural networks. And why does this seem fun is basically my question. And here's where my focus lies. There's a lot of amazing work that's been done on impulse control and behavioral regulation. And those systems are actually fairly well understood at this point in development. And we know that, yes, environment has an impact on that, but there's basically kind of a linear trend. You just get, with age, you get better and better and better at controlling your impulses, regulating your behavior. And that work is amazing science that's come out of a ton of labs. And there's this kind of push and pull between the reward system and the inhibition system. And with time, it gets better. That's not my question. My question is, what makes adolescents giggle when you bring this idea up? What gets them to the point where they have to regulate it? Most of you would stop at the pang in your gut. But I wanted to know. So I decided I would start with a very, very complex research design. I would ask them, bing, is the following a good idea? So I had them go into the MRI, and I watched what their brains did while they had a yes button and a no button. And so I'm just going to ask you some simple questions, and I want you to tell me if you think these are good ideas or not such good ideas, okay? And I brought a couple with you so you could get a sense of how hard these are. Here's a first one. Yes or no? Good idea? Maybe not so much. Okay, next one. How about that one? Okay. So they did a ton of these, and I measured their brain when they were first, gave them a little time to read, and then I measured what happened when they were contemplating before they answered. Now, it's important to know that I had 25 adults, 25 teens. Everyone answered 100% correctly in terms of saying no to the potentially dangerous things and yes to the neutral or positive things. So behaviorally, there's no difference. We know that's not true. The average age, by the way, of my teenagers was about 14. My adults, it was closer to 32. So what happened when they were responding to things? We'll go to our next slide. So over here, you see, these are the good ideas. And this is a bar showing reaction time. Bigger bar means more time. Lighter bar are the teenagers. The teenagers took a smidge longer than the adults to respond in terms of saying yes to the good ideas, but that difference is not statistically significant. So you honestly need to think of them as about the same. When we look at the more dangerous ideas or bad ideas, this dark bar again is the grown-ups. And if you compare it to the good ideas, that also statistically, that's not different at all. So that could all be noise. However, what is very, very different is for the potentially dangerous ideas, look at our adolescents. On average, that's a whopping statistical significant difference, by the way. On average, they were 300 milliseconds longer. And a lot of you are probably thinking 300 milliseconds is not such a long time. But this is 300 milliseconds in response to questions like, is it a good idea to light your hair on fire? No. What are you thinking about? What could you possibly be thinking about? 300 milliseconds is a car wreck. 300 milliseconds is a trigger pull. 300 milliseconds is a long time in the brain and even in behavior, especially to these questions. And this is, I think, where we get the, what were you thinking when we find ourselves confronted with hearing these scenarios? But I'm here hopefully to give you a little bit of insight on what they were thinking. All right, let's go to the next slide. What were they thinking? Well, here's what's going on in the brain, and this is fascinating to me. So when you compare the adults and adolescents and look at where was the brain most active when you're asked things like, is it a good idea to jump off a roof, to swallow glass, to light your hair on fire, swim with sharks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What parts of your brain become very active? And we see, this is the adults, the amygdala, your burglar alarm goes off, and your insula, your gut, starts going. Eat a cockroach is also one of them, of course. There's some gross ones in there, too. We see the same system that my colleague saw with the blue square. So again, reading these abstract questions that you may have not experienced yourself generates this fight or flight. It's a simulated fight or flight. Your body gets ready for like, oh, God, that's gross. No, 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 no. Our teenagers, not only did they not show activity in these areas, where were they more active brain-wise? That blue spot. Now, most of you are going, great, it's a blue spot. Right. Where is it? It's in the prefrontal cortex. It's up in the front of the brain. It's the part of the brain that's the most immature. That's the piece of brain they're using when they're confronted with these decisions. Why? Because they're thinking about it. And if you don't believe me, the amount of activity in that spot during the task correlates, is predicted by the amount of time they took to answer. So when they're confronted with these questions, they literally are thinking about them. Go to our next slide, which I think is the clip. Right, so we can go one more slide. Right, and so this is a clip from the Larry News Hour. They came up to do a story on the lab, and they asked these 4 girls who are sitting in a row if it's a good idea or a bad idea to swim with sharks. And the first girl says something like, immediately, right out of the gates, immediately negates the whole question by saying like, well, it could be both bad or good. Like it would depend on like if you had a buddy you were swimming with, because then it might like be safe, but it could also be kind of dangerous. The second girl says, yeah, I mean, it could be a dangerous thing to do, but it could also be like a whole new experience, and you could really learn something, especially like if you had someone with you who knew something about sharks. Now the third girl, who looks a little bit older, flips her hair and says, her first response to the question is, I agree with Haley that it could be okay if like you're with a buddy or something, and then you see her eyes dart back and forth, and her voice kind of cracks, and she's like, but I've read stories and heard things about people who've been hurt by sharks, so it kind of scares me, but it could be an interesting experience. And then the fourth girl says, yeah, like I think it could be like both bad or good, like it would really depend like if you were alone or if you like had a buddy that was with you, because then it might be more safe. Like I totally agree with Haley. So, and these are this is top level English, by the way. So these are the rising stars. Now that third girl had an adult response. You saw her have a gut response. Her eyes went, like she clearly had a fearful response, like this is such a dumb question. Why are they sitting, like there was nothing in the question about a buddy or a lifeguard or a shark expert. It was a simple, is it a good idea? Now, as someone, I'm a scuba diver. I know that the sharks come in varieties that are friendly, but generally speaking, if someone asks you that as a general question, the answer generally is no. And it was really unfortunate because they stopped rolling the camera, and I actually said to the girls, what would your parents want you to say? And they all immediately said, oh, no, it's a bad idea. They all knew. And what was funny is to see this third girl struggle, because this is filmed up in Vermont. in the average 7th grader's life in mid-Vermont, what is more likely to kill her during the day? A great white shark or Haley? The other girls. The other girls. So I'm going to finish up this piece on decision making, but then we're going to go to talk about sort of the peer influence piece, because watching this clip a couple times got me thinking, and it got me to do a second experiment that I think you'll find informative. What this is telling us, actually, you can go to the next slide, I think, yeah. So the inclination we have to ask the young people in our lives, what were you thinking? We really should replace it with, what were you feeling? But this is not practical advice. Do not say this to teenagers, because they already look at you like you have 10 heads, and asking them, what were you feeling, will only make that worse. So this is not, don't actually do this. This is just for your own knowledge. That it's not, and it's most likely, if they've made a bad choice, it's not because they didn't know any better. It's because nothing kicked in to tell them this isn't a good idea. It's very easy, go ahead and click one more time. This idea of a gut sense. This is one of the things that I think trips up so many adults when we're working with younger people. Because our gut sense is automatic, and think about it a lot like your language. Like, you don't remember how you got your language. You just did. Your first one. Some of you are fluent in the second one because you worked really, really, really hard. And if any of you are bilingual from birth, you got 2 installed for the price of 1, and you don't know how you got either one of them. You just can. And so because it's automatic, like a lot of the pangs we get in our gut when we're doing something wrong, we don't remember the day that showed up. It became present over a long period of time with a lot of experience, but we weren't conscious of a lot of it. So we have this automatic unconscious system that we then hold other people accountable for. Because if someone says, do you want to go swimming with sharks, and I have swallow broken glass, and I'm like, ugh. Now, why do I cringe? Well, I cringe because of a lifetime of experience. A 2 or 3-year-old will tell you, they'll tell you no, because they know glass is dangerous. But that's because they're following rules. It's not because they have experience. It's because they've been told over and over and over and over and over about dangerous things, and because toddlers and young children still follow what adults say. When you are in that in-between stage of adolescence of trying to figure out what's right and wrong for you specifically, that whole system softens up, and it becomes reliant on your own experience. And without experience, your gut system, that go-to, doesn't develop. Go ahead to the next slide. So these fast decisions actually are more emotional. And I don't mean emotional in the way that you tend to think about it. I mean emotional in terms of that internal heart racing, gut churning, respiration going. That's the system that you need to make these fast, kind of important decisions. And it's acquired over time. This is my son. I don't dress him. He does all of his own clothing, so this is not my fault. I apologize. But this is just a regular day. Why not? And he was riding his tricycle, and he wanted to, I usually would walk out our front door. We have a sidewalk that has a bit of an incline, and then it goes into a T. So it's a 90-degree turn. And on the other side of that sidewalk is a parking lot. And because there's a bit of an incline, you can get a little bit of speed going. And he was almost 4 in this picture. I would pick up the tricycle and walk it down to the bottom of the incline and let him start at the bottom of the T so that he wouldn't get hurt. And so on this particular morning, he said, Mama, can I ride down the hill, please? And I said, no. And when we practice your turns a little bit more, because it's a really sharp turn, you got to make the turn or else you're going to go in the parking lot. Oh, please, Mama. And I was like, no, I'm sorry, hon, we got to practice more. And then he said it in a way that, and if any of you are parents, you know this tone of voice, where they're asking you, but they're actually not asking you. What they're saying is, I'm going to do this. I can either do it now while you're here, or I can do it when you turn around and are not looking. You know that tone of voice? That kind of like, oh, please? There's this very, and I was like, okay. Okay, but if I let you do it, you're going to have to pull the handlebars really hard when you get to the bottom of the hill. I can, I'm ready. I was like, okay. Because I thought to myself, I can stand at the bottom of that hill, and I can physically stop him on a tricycle. I can physically stop him from going into the parking lot. So I can make sure he doesn't get hit by a car, which is my biggest fear. But I'm pretty sure he's not going to make the turn, and we're going to end up in a pile together on the ground. So he comes coming down the incline, and I'm going, turn, pull the handlebars, pull. And he gets about here, and I go, pull! And so he yanks the handlebar, dumps the tricycle, in an act that I never anticipated seeing, actually puts his hands out, which was what astounded me more than anything, because I've never seen him block his own fall. Puts his hands out, lands on the pavement, I'm waiting for the cry, jumps up. I can see the little pebbles in his hands. I can see his hands are scraped. He's like, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay. And I was like, all right, okay, okay. Can I do it again? And I was like, oh, God. And again, if you're a parent, you know this feeling of like, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, I cannot have a martini. How am I going to get through this particular behavior? And I was like, sure, why not? So he does it again, and guess what? He fell again. He did it a third time. Almost made it, but didn't fall. And it was the fourth, fifth, or sixth time. At some point, he actually made the turn. Now, why am I telling you this long story that's highly irrelevant? It's actually quite relevant, because he just got a two-wheeler about 3 weeks ago. And I told him that if he jammed the brakes too hard on the front wheel, that he could go over the front of the handlebars. Really? And he said it with this kind of like awe about it, like, oh, I'd fly in the air. Then I was like, yeah. Do you remember when you were learning to ride your tricycle and you fell off? Yes. And I said, okay, if you do this, it's going to hurt about 5 times as much. Oh, really? Okay. I'm going to go really slow at first. What would you rather have your kid do? Fall off a tricycle, or go over the handlebars of a two-wheeler, or dump a motorcycle? So these are the kinds of experiences, as hard as they are for us to endure as parents or as people who love our children. Let them fail. Let them fail let them fail a course. Like, honestly, I teach college, and I have kids who cannot function because they got a B+, because they've never gotten anything lower. They have no experience bank to pull from. In high school, I got a -10 on my calculus final. I am not kidding you. I have a PhD from Harvard. I got a -10 on my calculus final. And some of you are sitting there going, you can't get a negative grade on a test. Oh, yes, you can in math, because my teacher took 10 points off if you used pen. And I didn't have a pencil for the final because I wasn't prepared. And I didn't get any points, and I used a pen. So I literally got the thing back and was like, I remember looking at the top, seeing -10 and being like, 10 off of what? Like, assuming there were some other points. I mean, like, looking at it and being like, oh, there are no points. And oh, that's the total. Okay. If you want to blow your average in a course, get a negative number on a big exam, because that will just kill the whole term. I survived, and I still get to do what I wanted to do with my life. It was a good learning experience, and I was more upset than that, but it took a good 2 hours for me to comprehend that I got a negative number. It was a good learning experience. It was a cheap lesson. Better that than at my dissertation, right? Better then, because then I knew, okay, wait, all right, I gotta put it together if I'm gonna stay in school. So what I'm trying to tell you by the long way is, actually go ahead to the next slide. It's all about good parenting. This is what happened about 3 hours later. Mom, can I jump off this? No. And then this proceeded to happen. Now, I have a photograph of it so you know what I was doing. I'm an excellent parent at all times. And again, if the lighting was better here, you would be able to see that his knees are completely covered with grass stains, because this is about the 5th time that he's done this and just fallen, just completely wiped out. These are cheap lessons. We want to, so I'm giving you some silly examples because the hard ones are real bummers. But you want your kids and your adolescents to have good, cheap experience. You want stuff like this. I would love to see a kid fall out of a tree enough times that they know that wrecking a car would be hideously painful. If you don't have that bank to pull on from your gut and you feel the car going faster and faster and faster, so many of you, if your car skids in the snow, feel terrified even though you've never been in a car wreck. Well, why? Because maybe you went sledding and know what it feels like to slide around, or maybe you slipped on ice as a kid, but you have some experience. And we put our kids in situations where they're not able to acquire this bank of experience. And then we get mad at them because they haven't acquired it. All right, go ahead to the next slide. So this is another really good clip that I will have to improv for you. So go ahead and hit one more time. So there's this great moment in Dory. So I think this is the rub, especially as parents and mentors and teachers and people who love our adolescents, especially when they're struggling. And most of you probably know the story of Nemo, where the little fish has gone missing, and his dad is out searching the world's oceans for him. And he's found a helper in another fish named Dory, who is a great helper, except for she has no short-term memory, which gets in the way of helping, but makes her, actually, Dory just came out this weekend. So they're looking, and they're stuck in the mouth of a whale in this particular clip, and he's feeling very defeated. And he's feeling like a really bad parent for losing his kid and not being able to find him. And so Dory says, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. And he says, no, it won't. I promised that I'd never let anything happen to him. And there's this, dramatic pause, and then Dory says, that's a funny thing to promise. You can't let nothing happen to him. Then nothing would ever happen to him. Not much fun for a little Harpo. And he just looks at her like, huh? But think about it for a minute. That's the rub, right? We don't want anything to happen to him. But if we do, then nothing will ever happen to him. So how do you learn? That's the whole trick, is how do we train up the insula in non-lethal ways? And how do we do it soon enough that they're ready for the challenges that their particular environment presents them with? Go ahead to the next slide. So these fast decisions, they're driven by emotion. A lot of them are not driven by knowledge. And this is why, and this is pointed out in the first talk elegantly, flooding teens with knowledge does not help them make good decisions. Coming up with practical ways they can have experiences that inform their decision making is a much better way to teach them. Okay, to the second point, peers matter a lot. We'll quickly turn to the Haley effect. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so then again, this was a really cool clip. Go ahead to the next one. You actually see in the clip, you see a kid do a backflip off of a huge, probably 2-story concrete tower. And then it slows down. You see him do this perfect backflip and then roll. And his buddy's standing there, and then obviously the third guy's filming. And his buddy walks over to him, and you hear them go, cool, and like high five. And the question I usually ask people, especially people who do the kind of work you do, is, do you think that kid would have done that? It's awful to watch. He does it fine, but it's terrifying to watch. Would he have done that if he was walking home from school alone? Probably not. But with 2 buddies, much more likely, right? How often is it that, especially boys, rarely get into trouble on their own, but 2, 3 boys and a kind of a funky idea, much more likely to happen. So peer influence happens for both boys and girls. Why? Because peers are critically important. You have about 300 interactions per day with your peers during adolescence. And if you're a healthy adolescent, the first thing that you want to do when you get home is talk to them some more. Have any of you had your parents say to you when you were younger, when you wanted to, at least my generation, I wanted to get on the telephone, because it was before texting and before all that stuff, but you want to get on the telephone, and your parents are like, what could you possibly have to talk to those people about? You just spent all day with them. And if you're a healthy teenager, your answer should be something like, duh, everything. Now think about it. Like, what wasn't covered during the day? Well, I'll ask you again to think about toddlers. Have any of you ever watched a movie with a 3-year-old? Once, twice, 600,000 times? Has anyone had to watch the same movie? You've had to watch it over and over and over, and you're like, seriously? Right now, for some reason, the Aristocats has regained popularity in my house, and it's driving me out of it. I could do the entire movie for you. I won't, I swear. But I'm like, you guys now why? Why? I'll tell you why. Your memory, as an adult, you have a working memory of about 2 hours, which is why if a movie for us goes over 2 hours, it better be good. Because at about 2 hours, you start running out of space. So unless the movie's super interesting and able to push your working memory a little farther than it's actually physically able to go, it's not going to stick. Hollywood didn't come up with that. Hollywood actually caved to the neurology of humans. We have about 2 hours. That's a fully developed frontal lobe. When you're 3, you don't have a lot of horsepower yet. So you can't remember more than maybe 5-6 minutes of life at a time. So what kids do when they're watching movies is they pull chunks out of the movie. And I really, really saw this solidified because I was watching when The Lion King was in constant rotation in our house, because it was a good 2 or 3 months of Lion King. Watching my son watch it, he's a very expressive boy, and while he was watching one of the songs, and he was looking at it like he'd never seen it before, and this is the 1,000th watching, never seen it before, and then he starts to get this look of excitement, and then he goes, "To be king," and then goes back to being and I was like, okay, so while you're pulling some of it in, while you're encoding, you're missing. So honestly, every time they want to see it, it's a new movie. Because there are little pieces they remember, and they're like, oh, okay, I know this part, so I don't have to use up my energy on this. Oh, that's cool. But while you're processing that, you just missed another 2 minutes. So you're going to have to watch it again. Now, how does this relate to middle school? So I assume when you guys started middle school, you all got the handbook about which jeans were the coolest and how to wear your backpack, and today, which text, which text words are cool and not cool right now. You get the whole briefing sheet. No, you don't. Nobody tells you any of that stuff. And think about it. As a senior in high school, how many freshmen did you know? Not too many. As a freshman or sophomore in high school, how much did you know about the juniors and seniors? Everything. You knew who the popular people were, you knew who they were going out with, you knew what sports they played, you knew everything about them because they're highly relevant to your survival. But you can't remember everything, especially in middle school. You cannot remember the whole day. So this is the reason that teenagers want to hang out all the time. And we don't give them enough time to hang out anymore because for some reason we've become convinced that if you put 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 of them together in a rec center, all hell will break loose, which is so far from the truth. They actually have no interest in adults. And watch, have any of you seen this in like a mall? It's one of my favorite things. You'll see 4 or 5 teens together, and they're usually texting each other while they're walking together. And you'll see a 40-something like me walking down the same side of the mall, and they'll see this group of teens and literally go to the other side of the mall. And I'm like, all I can think of is those teenagers could care less about you. You're absolutely uninteresting to them. They have their own culture that you are not part of. If any of you are fluent in text, you need a hobby. You should not be fluent in text. You should know a bit, like we all know LOL and BFF, and you should know a bit so you can reference it. But if you're fluent in the language of adolescence, then you're not hanging out with your peers. You need to become fluent in the language of your peers, and to do that you need time, and since your memory isn't fully formed, you need people to rehash with, because there's no video to replay. So think of how many times, have any of you ever heard conversations between adolescent girls that go something like, oh my God, after 3rd period when I was standing by my locker and Jeff walked by and I was like, hey, and he was like, hey, like, did I sound like I liked him? Because like, I don't like him, but I might like him, I kind of want to ask him to dance, but I don't want him to think that I was, like acting like weird, like was I acting like weird around him? And your friend will be like, oh my God, no, because I actually saw Ryan and Jim and I asked him, I was like, oh, did you notice that Abby's talking to Jack in the hallway after 3rd period? Have you heard these conversations? They go, and you literally hear them go round and round and round, and you're like, you're still talking about the same thing, you're still talking about the same thing. Why? It's practice. It's very important practice. And it's ways that they can socially give each other information very subtly without hurting each other's feelings. It's rewinding the movie. They need to rewind the movie. They need to see the same movie over and over again until they learn all the cues. And when we don't give adolescents places to hang out and to rehash, they make them anyway. And this is where we get into trouble. Again, we can't be in the peer group, but if any of you grew up in neighborhoods, there usually were a couple adults that were in the periphery. And again, they didn't want to like get into it with you, but then in our neighborhood, there was this woman who was always on her porch. She just was. She was an older woman, she was always on her porch. Her name was Mrs. Del Vecchio, and she'd be like, oh, it's those Baird kids, or oh, it's those Smith kids. Like, you had this sense that like you got up to a little mischief, but if anything got out of hand, she knew at least one kid in the group and someone's parent was getting a phone call. And we don't have that kind of neighborhood stuff. We don't have a lot of communities like that anymore. We don't have community centers where the kids are left to do what they want to do, and there are a few adults hanging around that the kids, again, as was so nicely demonstrated in the earlier talk, that the kids don't want to disappoint. Adults who, again, you don't have to be the cool mom. You just have to be a consistent mom or a consistent adult that says, like, you guys can mess around a little bit, but you know what? If it starts to get out of hand, there's going to be a consequence. And the consequence isn't that we're going to take away your social time. We'll come up with something that's embarrassing, because embarrassing teenagers is the most aversive thing ever. So you do need to learn everything that you need to learn. Parents and peers up there is just to remind you that a lot of times there's a shift away from parents in early adolescence that parents can feel very sad about and can even resent. And honestly, it's a sign of health. If your teenager is paying more attention to their peers than to you, that's because they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that's because you're a known entity. Kids who grow up in unstable homes and never know their parents never stop trying to figure out what their parents are going to do next. But if you're from a home where your parents have been clear with you for 13 years, then you're going to pay more attention in middle school than to your parents, because they know you need to learn text. You already know that look that your mother has. You know that look? Yeah, you know that look. You already got it. If you got that at 13, you can attend to middle school. If you've grown up in a very dysfunctional house, you often won't. You'll be still trying to figure out the rules of your house, which means you don't pay as much attention to the social rules of middle school, which now puts you out of the loop in both. And again, is a recipe for not so good stuff. Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to look at a little bit of this peer learning and how just like thinking about having Haley in that, just asking those 4 girls that question. What was it about having that anchoring response, that one girl saying something that changed the way all of them were thinking? So I made up, this is done up at Dartmouth, and I made up a completely fake website. So one of the cool things about teens right now is they think they can be online anywhere at any time, which is great. So we made, these are all still pictures, okay? So none of this is online, none of this is real. It's all just made to look real. It's just pictures. They're all in the MRI, and I'm measuring their brain activity. And I said to them, we have this website that we just started, and we did have a mock version of the website up, so teenagers could go and see it and play this game if they wanted to. But it was not actually on while they were in the magnet being tested. And what we said to them was, we're having people your age just answer some simple questions. They're just opinion questions, and none of them were terribly emotional. And what we're going to do is we're going to have you do the first run offline because it's kind of hard with the magnet and the noise and you're pressing keys, and so we just want you to have a practice run. So we had them go through and do about 100 questions just like this. The only thing that changed was we said, okay, great, you've become very good at it. And now what we're going to do is we're going to have you create a username and a password, log on to the active portion of the site, and we're going to have you, again, answer a bunch of the same questions. And all the questions were mixed between the two depending on the person who came in. So go ahead and click. The only thing that's going to change is this time after you answer, once you've logged in, you get to see what percentage of people in your age group agreed with you. And the website actually randomly pulls people's answers to post. So I have to warn you, your answer may be seen by people online. That was the manipulation. No one's answer was going to be seen because these were pre-generated photographs, okay? Does that make sense? So it's not possible for you to show up here. But what I said to them was, I have to warn you, there's a chance that your answer might be seen by other people online. 100% of our participants believed they were online. None of them were. 92% of them believed that at least one of their answers would be seen, would show up. None of them were shown. And when I remember saying to a couple of the girls, just out of curiosity, it's a login name. It's not even your actual name. Would you be concerned if it popped up? And they looked at me like I was from a different planet, which I might be, but they looked at me and were like, yeah, but everybody knows everybody's logins. Like, you can totally tell who's who. Interesting. Okay, so what happened in the brain? Go to the next slide. So this first up here is what happens when you think you're alone. You're making decisions you're offering your opinion about different things. And when you think you are private, when you think about yourself, this looks just like an adult doing the same task. All that changes between the first part and the second part is your answer might be seen by people your age. This region goes completely quiet. And what shows up? This is our good old friend, that at this point should be old news to you guys, the amygdala and the insula on both sides. This is the same system that could not get up and go to lighting your hair on fire. But it's more than ready to go like gangbusters if Haley might disapprove of your answer. Honestly, this result to me was both thrilling and terrifying, right? So this system isn't hardwired to keep you alive in terms of actual things in your environment, but it is hardwired to make you pay attention to the people who can help guide you. So if you think your peers who have the critical information to keep you alive are in the surround, then your gut system gets going. And think about being a teenager, think about feeling ostracized as a teenager. Where do you feel it? Right in the gut. So they're learning from their peers. So everything that you heard this morning from Dr. Latessa about grouping these kids up and putting mild offenders with serious offenders could not be more right. And here's the brain piece to back that up. This is the learning system. This is the system that's going to create their gut sense. So if you are put in an environment where you're not getting the right stuff from your peers, you're going to learn to behave in the wrong way. Next slide. So one of the things that we don't think about is positive peer pressure. And again, it was mentioned this morning, I think the example was heroin, and it was funny because I honestly use that example all the time of being in a peer group. If you're in a peer group where no one does drugs, and you're like, hey, let's go buy some heroin, your friends will all look at you and be like, wait, what? And then a lot of times kids will be like, oh, I'm totally kidding, whatever. Yeah, let's watch a movie. If all of your friends are volunteering on Saturday, guess what you're doing, whether you want to or not? If you're in high school or middle school, we don't think about these things. When positive peer pressure works, we kind of take it for granted. But we don't think much about how to harness it and actually use it. And it's tricky because, as I said, we're not their peers. We're not adolescents' peers. We can only create the context. We can't actually be their peers. So this right now is kind of food for thought. And my guess is a lot of programs that work that are peer-based have some adult structure to them as well. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, that was just another example. Okay, one more. This is a trampoline park that's close to my house. So in terms of combining these things, imagine if you could combine positive peer experience with a little bit of physical risk taking. Now, how many of you are old enough, and I don't mean to reveal your age, but anyone who's at least my age or older, how many of you went to school in a gymnasium that had climbing ropes that you could go to the ceiling? A couple of you, okay. And there's a smooth one and one with knots in it, the one smooth one being harder. And it usually went up about 2 stories, right? The ropes. And you knew nothing bad could happen because there was that like 2-inch red mat on the floor. So if you fell from the ceiling, you'd be totally fine. Now here's my question for you. How many of you had people die in your gym class? Not too many. But you won't find many schools with those climbing ropes these days because it's a liability. But I guarantee you there were 2 or 3 boys who climbed those ropes and had everybody going, go, 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 or cheering for them, who got to the top and then actually didn't get in trouble on their way home from school because they had their social affirmation during the day in gym. So there are ways we can actually create safer experiences, and these trampoline things are crazy. I don't know if any of you have ever been to them, but you can injure yourself, you can, but it's pretty hard. And in the meantime, you can do lots of really cool stuff and hang out with your friends. So I think what we have to do is actually think about a lot of this stuff in terms of opportunity and how we can tap into it. Okay, next slide. So again, to reiterate what I said, we need experience. That's how we make our decisions, is from experience, from relevant experience. And the presence of our peers actually helps guide how that system develops over time. And it honestly does. Your friends do turn your brain on, and they do shape the way that your brain learns to talk to itself. So peer groups are critically important. Go ahead. So what does this mean for a lot of the work you do? Here are just a couple ideas, and again, I'll take more of this in question and answer if you guys want. Please remember, if you take away anything from my talk, that adolescents are a work in progress. Don't pathologize them right out of the gates. Now, a lot of the people that you're going to run across do have some pathology, so don't hesitate to look into it, but don't assume something is permanent, even when it's pathology. There's pathology that's specific to the adolescent years that if you work on, can be remediated and can disappear in adulthood. There is pathology that shows up in adolescence that is the beginning of quite serious pathology, so you can't completely ignore it. But don't assume all adolescent behavior that you don't understand is fundamentally pathological. It may very well not be. The environment is critical, absolutely critical. And I say this because one of the things that I think about all the time, and again, was covered earlier, so I won't spend much time on it, is recidivism. And when you have a teenager incarcerated for any length of time and expect them to function in any other social environment, you're doing something that doesn't make any sense. So you're basically teaching them Russian and then dropping them in Spain and expecting them to be fluent in Spanish. During the most critical social years where you're learning the social language of your people, if you are incarcerated, that is home. And think of how good you feel when you go home, because it fits. Because there's just something about the ease of, you know where things are, you know how things work, you know the expressions people use, you know the social rules, the social norms, you know what's expected of you. It's so much easier to be around the people you grew up with. So if you grew up with people incarcerated, whether you're conscious of it or not, that's where you're going to want to be, and that's where you're going to speak the most fluently, if you will, socially. Okay, next slide. So one of the things, I wrote a blog this past fall for the Campaign for Youth Justice, and it was a discussion of how insane it is to try juveniles as adults and to incarcerate them as adults. In New York State, we hopefully after this coming year it will be different, but right now we will send someone who's 16 years old to Rikers. 16 years old, you can go to an adult prison. Think of most boys at 16 years old. They are not adults. And one of the points I made was how, if you think about how fundamentally flawed this thinking is, so if you do something that shows that you're immature as a juvenile, you can get held over to adult court. But there's nothing as an adult that you can do to get held over to juvenile court. And I thought of this because my best friend and I, a few years ago, were very upset about something, a particular person. And we were talking about it, and we actually were trying to think of something we could do that would really aggravate them, but not hurt them. We didn't want to do anything antisocial. And I don't know which one of us came up with it first, but one of us came up with the idea of egging their house. And I remember we both were like, yeah, let's egg their house. And the plan got so far that my best friend said to her husband, hey, do we have any eggs in the fridge? And he was like, are you kidding me? Are you too serious right now? And I was like, well, I mean, it's vandalism, like it's wrong, but I mean, it's not gonna hurt them, and it really would be annoying, and they'd have to clean it up. And my best friend was like, yeah. I mean, if we get caught, like what's the worst thing that can happen? And I was like, well, we can get arrested. And what actually stopped me was thinking about having to explain to my college students that I got arrested over the weekend for egging somebody's house, and how juvenile that response was to feeling upset. I was upset about something, so at 42 years old, I got some eggs and threw them at a house. But there was no court that would kick my case to juvenile court, despite that being borderline infantile behavior. No adult eggs a house. So think about how ridiculous the idea that someone we know is immature, they're behaving immaturely, so we take them to the adult system. But there's nothing an adult can do to be put in the juvenile system. Also think about the fact there's no pro-social behavior that can get a teenager to be considered as an adult. If you've been caring for your younger brothers and sisters perfectly while your drug-addicted parent has been in and out of your life, if something happens to that parent, no court will give a 16-year-old custody of a 12-year-old. Even if that 16-year-old's been caring for them flawlessly for 3 years, getting them dressed, out the door, to school, safe, fed, and we know 16-year-olds who can do that. But no court would ever accept that. But they'll put them in prison for spray painting. Doesn't make sense if you think about what the brain's doing. If the brain has learned how to take care of a 12-year-old, then the kid can take care of a 12-year-old. If they've never done it before, no, then they can't. So peer-mediated courts are another thing that are starting to spring up. When you think of trial by jury of your peers, we know that children are not adults. Again, 16-year-olds can go to prison in New York State, but imagine if you walked in, we were talking about speeding tickets earlier, imagine if you walked in to fight your speeding ticket and either the jury or the judge was a 16-year-old. Imagine a jury of 16-year-old girls. You'd be sentenced to life for wearing the wrong thing. You'd walk in and you wouldn't even be able to start your defense. They'd be like, oh my God, she's gross. Seriously, ew, life. You'd be done. That's why 16-year-olds are not on juries. We know that they can't do these things, but we consider them adults otherwise. So peer-mediated courts, it's interesting, the data's starting to come in, and they're very, very effective. Teenagers do not like having to go in front of their peers when they've done something wrong. What's also interesting is that so far the data is showing that most peer-mediated courts are actually handing out harsher sentences than most typical courts. So there's somewhere in the middle there that might be a very fruitful line of future research. Okay, and then finally I wanted to make sure that I had the environment thing up there to punch it again. One more click, please. Very important for you all to know that the work I've talked to you about and the ideas I've shared with you are far from a one-woman show. I have a fantastic team of undergraduates and graduate students who work with me to produce the stuff you are seeing. You must be exhausted. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to stay for questions.